development of all types of symptoms. So we need such type of program which can throw a light on these complications which we are facing today. And this is very, very important webinar in which a lot of speakers of different fields are throwing light on this. I again congratulate our team which is doing this webinar, and all welcome all delegates who will definitely give have some knowledge about the post-COVID communication. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Now we start with the academic program. I invite Professor Aftab, Mohammad Aftab. He is currently professor and head of the department ENT, JN Medical College and Hospital. Earlier, he was working as associate professor in Motilal Nehru Medical College, Allahabad. He has recently joined our institute, and he is looking after the mucormycosis. He is in charge of the committee formed by the principal. So he will throw light on the presentation and how to prevent mucormycosis in patient of COVID-19. Dr. Aftab, it's up to you now.
Honorable Vice Chancellor, Professor Tariq Mansoor sir, our Dean, Professor Rakesh Bhargav sir, Dr. Rana, Superintendent of RML Hospital, Dr. Rushi, Dr. Shamim, Dr. Arif Mustaqim. Good evening to everyone and all the listeners and viewers of this webinar. First of all, I'll thank the organizers as well as our Vice Chancellor for giving me, appointing me as a chairman in this department recently. Now, everyone has told something about the COVID, its post-COVID complications, its impact on the society, its impact on the healthcare workers is also a very big one. So psychological impact which all the doctors, nurses, and everyone which are there facing because of the sudden surge, or you can say the overwhelming of the patients, and some scarcity or some, you can say, of the deficiency in our system. So the psychological impact is also on the healthcare workers also. Now coming on to the topic of mucormycosis, I'll be sharing my screen. There's just a few slides.
ये चाय ले जा मैडम, गरम कर दे।
Is it visible to everyone? Hello?
No, no.
It's visible?
No, no.
Just a minute.
Hello? आज तो आई नहीं मेरे पास, आज तो मुझसे बात ही नहीं कर रही है।
Now it's visible?
It's going to be visible. Yes, yes. Now it's visible now.
It's visible now.
Yes, yes. Good. Continue.
So coming on to mucormycosis, everyone knows it's an emerging angioinvasive infection caused by the fungi mucorales of the order of Zygomycetes. Generally, mucormycosis has emerged as the third most common invasive mycosis in order of importance after candidiasis, aspergillosis, and in patients, basically, as Professor Rana has said, in the patients of immunocompromised patients and especially the transplant patients. But recently, the new, because of the emergence of diabetes mellitus as a new pandemic all over the world, the uncontrolled patients of uncontrolled diabetes, this is also much more common. Those patients who are landing up in uncontrolled diabetes, long-term uncontrolled diabetes, landing up in DKA, that is diabetic ketoacidosis. So these fungal infections, they are emerging much more as it was about 2 decades or 3 decades back. Again, the technical point, the fungi is of Mucorales species and genera Rhizopus. You can see in the picture, there are 2 petri dishes. On the left, it's the fungi mucus, mucor, which was initially grown, and the color is yellow. You can observe it's a bit creamish color. And on the right, larger one, it's black. The black color of the fungus is just because of the spores. The color of the spores is black, and this gives the black or the black fungus, the name black fungus. But we as a clinician, we have to look into it. This yellow or creamish necrotic material, this is also fungus. So once when you do the endoscopy, you can find this color also, and don't get that misconception and the news floating. It's a yellow fungus. Basically, this is the fungus, and when their spores grow on those fungi, it gives that black color. So the misconception which was floating in the news about the two days back, it's a yellow fungus, white fungus, XYZ. Basically, when the spores appear, then only it gets the color of black fungus. Now, coming on to how do you get this infection? This fungi mucor, it's present in the atmosphere, and sometimes it's a natural commensal of the nose also, nasal mucosa. Only when there is a decrease in immunity or decrease in the defense mechanism, then we get infected. So the mechanism is basically inhalational also only, no other method. The predisposing conditions for getting the infection is, as I've already told, it's the uncontrolled diabetes mellitus or with diabetic ketoacidosis. Again, an immunocompromised condition, whether the malignancies. Then the transplant recipient, as Professor Rana has said. Then on the long-term corticosteroid, steroid therapy or immunosuppressive therapies, those patients of CLD. Another thing is iron overload. Iron overload, chelation therapy with desferoxamine or something like that. The reason is the mucor thrives on the free iron which is in the blood. So in iron chelation therapy, there's the level of free iron is more. And similarly in COVID-19, everyone has noticed the serum ferritin level was quite high. Those patients who had long-term or the patient which had who had increased this viral load, they had this higher level of serum ferritin. And this serum ferritin, the free iron, is the bread and butter of the mucor. So the high iron level or the high serum ferritin level was also responsible for that. Now another thing comes, this antifungal drug voriconazole. If you those patients who were in ICU, they could have been given voriconazole as an antifungal element for, and it's a drug of choice for aspergillosis, for the fungus aspergillus. But the aspergillus as such is a competitive inhibitor of mucor. So if you have given this voriconazole, this has killed the aspergillus, but the mucor has thrived upon. So this voriconazole could also have been another cause of rise in mucormycosis. Then neutropenia, generalized neutropenia, which is again was present in COVID patients. Now coming into the types of mucormycosis, uh, the first one which we are dealing right now is this rhinoorbital cerebral mucormycosis, the most common type. Then there are pulmonary, GI, cutaneous, renal, disseminated, and other things. But right now we are much more and concerned with rhinoorbital cerebral mucormycosis, because the number of cases which are coming or which are presenting in the OPD or which are presenting in the post-COVID OPDs is of this one. Now, the relationship of mucormycosis in COVID-19 or COVID-19 patients is, as I've already said, mucormycosis occurs basically in the immunocompromised state. And the causes could be, the COVID-19 induced lymphopenia, the reduction of the CD4 and CD8, which leads to the immunosuppressed states. Then COVID itself induced those pre-diabetic or pro-diabetic patients who are not aware of their sugar status, and when they landed up in the ICUs or in the wards because of the steroid therapy and all those things, they converted into fulminant diabetes, and this could be another cause. Then there was inflammatory cytokine surge, especially increased IL-6. And as I mentioned, the increased serum ferritin level. This was one of the, I think, important cause of mucormycosis in COVID-19 patients. Again, excuse me, as people have said, steroids leading to, indiscriminate or you can say not unmonitored dose of steroid leading to this hyperglycemic state or uncontrolled glycemia leading to this COVID-19, this mucormycosis. Then, as I mentioned, neutropenia as such caused by the COVID-19 infection, and the use of immunomodulators like this tocilizumab, then this broad spectrum use of antibiotics in the COVID ICU patients because of the mixed infections. There was the competitive inhibition or the loss of the general, as Professor Rana said, the loss of the general, gut flora or the flora which was causing competitive inhibition. There was this which was lost, and then patients on long-term oxygen supplementation. Then the various theories are there. Could not maintain the hygiene of the humidifier, the mask, and many other factors. So these are all the hypotheses which could be the cause of increased mucormycosis cases in the post-COVID patients. Now, as we are right now dealing with the rhinoorbital cerebral mucormycosis, the symptoms mainly the patient which are presenting are the facial pain, unilateral facial pain, the sinus headache, or you can say the frontal headache, and nasal blockage, unilateral nasal blockage. These are the early signs: the unilateral facial pain, headache, and unilateral nasal blockage. If you are getting these three symptoms and you have a history of COVID-19 infection, history of hospitalization, history of oxygen therapy, history of steroid medications, whether in the home or home isolation or whether in the hospital, then if you are seeing these three symptoms, facial pain, sinus headache, and blocked nose, please do consult the ENT surgeons or ENT doctors as early as possible. Because the early, in this case, early detection is the thing. Then later on, you can get this a blood-stained nasal discharge or dark color nasal discharge. Then there is a dental pain or increased sensitivity sensation in the upper jaw as well as lower jaw, more commonly in the upper jaw. Then toothache, loosening of teeth. If there is involvement of the eyes through the sinuses, then earlier there is redness and retroorbital pain in the eyes. Then there is decreased vision. You can have diplopia, that is double vision because of the restricted movement of the eyeball. Then there is ptosis, means drooping eyelids, the upper eyelids, they get dropped. And later on, there is proptosis, that is bulging of the eyelid, restricted eye movements, or sometimes there is loss of eye movements. Another is if there is inferior involvement of the maxilla, then there is involvement of the palate also. So you can get any blackish discoloration or dark bluish discoloration of the palate, or you can get eschar. Recently, we have seen a case of eschar on just on the lips. About 3 days back in our OPD, it presented with just eschar on the upper lips. That's all. This was the presentation of mucormycosis. Then there's redness and swelling around the eyes. And if there is intracranial involvement, all the signs of intracranial involvement like headache, vomiting, loss of consciousness, disorientation, all these things will be there. Now, the diagnosis, what we say, the early diagnosis is, if you have the symptoms of unilateral facial pain, headache, nasal blockage, or discharge, consult any ENT surgeons and get a nasal endoscopy done. This is the thing. And most of the times, nasal endoscopy itself is diagnostic, and you get this dark colored turbinates or dark colored septum or anything bluish or dark black colored eschar. And this blackish color is not because of the fungus. Once again, I'm reiterating, it's not because of the fungus, it's because of the necrosis of the involved tissue, and which gives the black color right here. You can get a yellowish discharge, thick yellowish creamish discharge, which I showed you on that better dish, and you should suspect in this scenario that it could be a mucor case. Then so direct endoscopy, direct nasal endoscopy, jo hai, this is the thing in the early diagnosis of mucormycosis. Now again, the alarming signs are, if there is blood-stained nasal discharge, there's a diminution of vision, diplopia, that's a double vision, restricted eye movement, sluggish or absent pupillary reflex, then altered sensorium, vomiting, loss of consciousness, seizures, or focal neurological deficit. These are the signs of, alarming signs of intracranial invasion. Now coming on to the diagnosis. Diagnosis history as such is very important, because there is an history of COVID infection, whether managed at in home isolation or in the hospital setting. Then about the steroid therapy, the oxygen therapy, and all those things have to be taken into consideration. The oxygen, whether it was from the gas pipeline or through the cylinders or through the oxygen concentrators, the various things which have to be taken care. Then comes the clinical examination, especially again, I'm reiterating, again, I'm saying that direct nasal endoscopy, DNE is the thing to come into this for the diagnosis of mucormycosis, for the clinical diagnosis of mucormycosis, especially the rhino-orbital mucormycosis. Then at that setting itself, during the direct nasal endoscopy, we go for this fungal examination. We send the specimen for KOH. Then we send the sample for cytopathology and get a punch biopsy from that involved region for histopathology. These are the thing, and if we find this KOH fungal hyphae in aseptate fungal hyphae in KOH or in cytopathology or in histopathology, it's a confirmatory. Then another investigation is, to know the extent of the involvement, to know the extent of the disease, extent of the involvement of the disease. We go for the radiological investigation. What we are following here in our setup is in stage 1 and stage 2 disease, we are going for contrast enhanced CT scan, and in stage 3 and stage 4, we are going for CMRI, contrast enhanced MRI. This is what we are following, but the gold standard again is contrast enhanced MRI for knowing the extent of the disease. The staging as simple, it's very simple. If there's involvement of the nose, only nose and nasal mucosa and turbinates, stage 1. Involvement of the sinuses, stage 2. Involvement of the orbit, stage 3, and intracranial, stage 4. So if there is involvement with the orbit and the brain, we go for MRI. Otherwise, we are we go for this CT, PNS, paranasal sinuses, to know the extent of the disease. Now, the management point of view is basically this disease is a medical disease. First, we have to understand this. Basically, it's a medical disease. It has to be treated by the antifungal drugs, and everyone knows the drug of choice is liposomal amphotericin B. The second line, the posaconazole or isobuconazole. But what I'm here mentioning is surgical debridement. And the role of surgical debridement is, first, it reduces the fungal load. The important thing is it reduces the fungal load. Secondly, we reduce all the necrotic and dead materials, which are basically good, material for the mucor to thrive on. And the necrotic tissue is also acidic, and it helps the mucor to thrive in this acidic media. So we reduce this necrotic tissue. We remove all the necrotic tissue through debridement. Thirdly, it increases the penetration of the antifungal drugs to the normal tissues if you remove all the necrotic tissue. So in these three manners, the surgical debridement is helpful. Otherwise, the mainstay of the treatment is still the medical management, that is the antifungal drug, whether it's amphotericin B, whether it's posaconazole, whether it's isobuconazole. So the role of surgical debridement is only this much, that it reduces the fungal load, it reduces remove the necrotic material, so that there is no, that material for the mucormycosis to thrive on, and there is a reduction of the acidic media, and it increases the penetration of the antifungal drugs in the normal tissue. And this we are doing here in our setup through endoscopic way, by various other approaches, whether it's limited to the sinuses, nose. We're doing all the endoscopic surgeries through the Denkers approach and all those things. And right now we have operated 6 cases, and still about 6 to 7 are posted, and hopefully we'll try to do it, treat them as soon as possible. Now, medical management, again, it's very important because these patients have deranged sugar levels. So strict glycemic control is very important. And with the help of our endocrine people, we are trying to manage the sugar levels as early as possible. The dosage of liposomal amphotericin B, everyone knows. If it's a limited disease, that is stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, we are giving with 5 milligram per kg body weight, and if it's intracranial, then we have to raise it to 7 to 10 milligrams per kg body weight, with strict monitoring of the renal parameters, that is renal function test, serum electrolytes, especially potassium. We are doing intermittently every alternative. We are doing CRP in the operated patients so as to monitor the progression of the infection or control of the infection every alternate day, and renal function test and serum electrolytes. The second line treatment is the antifungal drug posaconazole. The doses are, everyone must be knowing about it. That's 300 milligram BD on the first day, and then 300 milligram OD. Now, question is how to prevent. In the post-COVID patients, we have to control their sugar level. The thing is a good glycemic control during the management of the COVID-19 patients. Judicious and apt, timely use. Judicious and timely use of steroid is there. Then universal masking reduces the exposure of mucorales and hence should be restricted above. Strict aseptic precautions while administering oxygen. Then this humidifiers and all those things. Daily change of sterilized humidifier and tubes. During the discharge, the patients should be explained about the early signs and symptoms of the mucormycosis, and mycological study to assess the presence and quantify fungal spore count should be done periodically in the ICU. These are the preventive measures. I hope I tried my best to just convey my message in a very limited manner. Thank you once again, everyone, for your patient hearing. And if you have any queries, we'll try to answer.
Thank you, Dr. Aftab, for your nice presentation covering all the aspects of mucormycosis. One question from the Professor Tamki ma'am. How long COVID-19 patients are at risk for mucor?
How long? We are getting patients as late as after a month also. Those who are negative and they have come across with this after 30 days with mucormycosis. So right now we cannot comment how long is the.
So do you advocate giving prophylaxis to such patients?
No, not at all. Not at all. Not at all. It's only basically early detection is basically the education of all the post-COVID patients. Whosoever patient is getting discharged, and the message should be clear and loud to everyone in the society in general. These are the early symptoms. You should be watchful and consult your nearest ENT doctors. Get a direct nasal endoscopy done. This is enough. But don't be get that panic कि हर सर दर्द वही हो रहा है या हर आंखों में दर्द हो रहा है. वो नहीं कि आज मेरे बस थोड़ी देर के लिए सर में दर्द हुआ, it could be COVID. थोड़ी देर के लिए मेरे चेहरे में दर्द हुआ, it could be COVID. This mucormycosis. नहीं. There's a continuity. अगर होगा थोड़ी देर लगातार होगा, loss of sensation होगा, fullness आएगी, तभी. तो basically ये है कि हमें ये message उनको सोसाइटी में एक जनरल पहुंचा देना कि these are the early signs and symptoms. अगर कुछ हो तो नियरेस्ट अपने ENT सर्जन को कंसल्ट करें. और
so can we go for nasal endoscopy before discharging the patient of COVID-19?
If they are yes, you can go. This can be done. This can be done. This can be done. If the patient is in the ICU or in the ward for a longer period of time, for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, then we can go for this. We can go for this.
What about amphotericin B is available in GNMC?
The availability is intermittent. We are getting it from the state government to the policy. Every day we send the data of the patients, the dosage required, and we are getting it, but in a limited quantity. What I'm saying, these handicaps are creating the topic as well of the talk was psychological impact. So the psychological impact is also on the healthcare workers.
You are also feeling the psychological impact.
Yeah, because of these handicaps. So these things are there, but yes, we are trying to manage to our best of our skills and best of our resources, and hopefully, inshallah, we'll get through it.
Thank you, Professor Aftab. Thank you for joining JNMC, and I hope under your guidance and your chairmanship, the department will develop. Thank you. Now, our next speaker is Dr. Abdul Rahman Khan. He is interventional cardiologist and director, cardiac catheterization lab at Shine Regional Medical Institute. He was ex-fellow in interventional cardiology, Harvard Medical School, Boston, USA. He is an alumni of JNMC. He is my immediate junior from 95 batch. Dr. Abdul Rahman, please.
Thank you, Shamim Bhai. Assalamu alaikum, everybody, and good evening. And I would thank all the participants who have joined to this webinar as late as probably it is almost 9 o'clock now. I would start by thanking all the organizers, Shamim Bhai and Aftab Bhai and all the other panelists, Dr. Rushi, Arif Bhai, as well as Dr. Tariq Mansoor and Professor Rana. And I would give a shout out to Asif Jha Bhai for coordinating this. And let me share my screen. As we can you see my screen now? Hold on. Probably not.
No.
Yeah, give me 1 second. So as we all know that COVID-19 is part of the lexicon now, and everybody knows about it.
Yes, we can see now.
We have learned a lot about COVID-19 in both in terms of medical professionals as well as laymen. And we all know that COVID-19 involves the lung, involves the other organs. Now we have another multicolored fungi in the lexicon, as reviewed very well by Dr. Aftab. So what I have to be assigned to speak is post-COVID cardiac monitoring. Before I do that, so this is how a coronavirus heart damage process. I like this figure, so I just kept it. So this is a central illustration which was presented in JACC. It shows how COVID-19 affects the heart. So what happens is SARS affect the lungs directly as well as the heart by the ACE2 receptors that we know of. When it affects the lung, the oxygenation of the lung, there's hypoxia. The patient does not have adequate oxygen. That puts a demand on the heart as well. So the demand supply mismatch is there. So patient can have a heart attack because of that. That is one possibility. The other is the virus itself directly attacks the myocardium of the heart or involves the heart muscles. It can cause what we call as cardiomyopathy, which decreases the heart function or the pumping function of the heart. And it can also give rise to what is known as myocarditis. Once again, that is because of the direct invasion or because of the circulating inflammatory markers. When somebody has COVID, all the inflammatory markers, because the body is trying to fight COVID as well. You have your raised D-dimer, raised DSR, raised CRP, and all these ferritin levels are raised as well. So all these inflammatory markers take a toll on the heart as well, which decrease the function of the heart. Besides that, what you have is a type 1 MI as well. So when I say type 1, it means somebody has a plaque and the inner lining of the blood vessel, it opens up and a clot forms there. And those person can have a heart attack as well. And we have seen a lot of both arterial thrombosis, that is heart attacks, a stroke, as well as venous thrombosis, which is clots in the veins in the leg, as well as clots in the lungs, which go and cause a pulmonary embolism. Besides that, there's one more entity which is known as stress cardiomyopathy, which is there is release of catecholamines or what we call as the fight and flight hormones in the body. And they cause the heart to become weak in a manner which is a characteristic manner, which is called as a broken heart syndrome or a stress cardiomyopathy. I think Arif Bhai will talk about the complications, but just wanted to show how the heart is being affected by coronavirus directly as well as indirectly by other mechanisms. Before we go ahead, let's see what is the scope of the problem. This is data from last year when COVID was there in New York. So if you can see, that in blue is 2019 deaths, and in red are 2020 deaths. So blue is ischemic heart disease. If you can see before March, this is the area, this is how the graph shows. Suddenly there was a spurt in ischemic heart disease after COVID-19. So we can see there's a lot of people who were dying of ischemic heart disease at that time. The spurt for heart failure was almost the same, but usually we see the long-term sequelae in these patients later on. Then we go and see in hypertensive heart disease that a lot of patients started to have hypertension. I think partly it was because of the lack of medications as well as the stress response to that. A small rise in stroke in these patients in terms of cerebrovascular disease. Coming to ischemic heart disease once again. So what is happening? There are two kinds of patients. One is somebody who has underlying heart disease and who developed COVID. The other is the patient population who did not have any known cardiovascular or ischemic heart disease, and then they go on to develop COVID. So both the patient populations can give rise to this deaths because of ischemic heart disease. There were some patient factors which were associated. We'll talk about it in terms of the comorbidities. They may have associated diabetes, high blood pressure, high cholesterol levels, as well as they may not have come to the hospital. In fact, there was a study in which I was involved because last year I was in Boston, and we saw that almost 40% we saw a dip in 40% of the cases who were coming with heart attacks for PCIs or for stenting. This was seen in Italy as well at that time. It doesn't mean that patients were having less number of heart attacks. It just meant that they were so scared to come to the hospital that they'll get COVID that they stayed in the hospital and they developed sudden cardiac death. In fact, there was another study which showed this. This is in New York City at the time of COVID-19. If you see, the cardiac arrest calls had increased because the patients were staying at home and they were dying at home. This has been confirmed. So a lot of patients were dying at home, be it with sudden cardiac death, be it with hypoxia, be it with stroke, and they were not coming to the hospital. So this was one reason. The other is the reason the healthcare systems were overwhelmed at every place. Besides the severity of the disease that patients had, the healthcare systems were overwhelmed. I mean, all the ICU beds are full, all other beds are full. So this led to, I would say, if not mismanagement, but in terms of lack of the patient, everybody was stressed, the healthcare workers were stressed, the people were stressed. So this led to a lot of COVID-related deaths or cardiovascular deaths at that time. So what I have divided is, because a lot of people here are not in the medical field who have joined, is I'll try to simplify it in the manner that what to do and how to monitor these patients who have COVID. So let's say there's one set of people who don't have COVID and who don't have heart disease. The only thing they have to do is mask up and vaccinate. Please vaccinate. There's no perfect vaccine. There may be anecdotal reports of issues with every vaccine, but I think vaccination is the best way forward or at this point of time. The second is the patient population who does not have COVID and who does have existing heart disease. So it's the majority of patient population we have. Okay, they did not have COVID, but they do have heart disease. So we have to control their blood pressure, control their cholesterol levels, control their diabetes if they have, regular physical activity. If they cannot go out, they can stay at home and be physically active. This is the patient population. If they have something, they have to speak up. They cannot stay at home and just probably, let's say, if they have some chest pain or shortness of breath, they cannot sit at home and think, oh, I'll ride it out. I don't have to do anything. Probably it will go away. No, you have to contact your healthcare provider. You have to contact somebody so that we know what is the severity of the condition that you have. The third list of patients are those patients with COVID and who do not have any known heart disease. So this can be divided further into patients who have mild COVID, who can be treated at home, or who are being treated at home, who don't have pneumonia, who don't have hypoxia. They're being treated with all the cocktail available at what we have at this juncture. And then there's the moderate to severe patients who do need hospitalization sometimes or do have pneumonia or hypoxia. So these are the patients, I alluded to the slide in the past, that these are the patients who, so let me show you this thing. So it's important for people to be aware that COVID-19 can affect their heart. So tell their doctor if they're experiencing something. In fact, I forgot to show this slide. This is what happened in New York at that time. In the 10 weeks following the declaration of the COVID-19 emergency, the visits to the emergency department declined. It was almost 25% for heart attack patients, and we saw 40% patients with STEMI. So 20% patients with stroke, and uncontrolled blood sugar decreased 10%. So patients were not coming to the hospital because they were scared. They were anxious, they were stressed out, and they were scared. So once again, this is another slide which shows that how myocardial injury in this patient population happens. These are the patients, mind you, who do not have any known heart disease and who develop COVID. So cytokine storm leads to decreased heart function, or maybe heart failure as well, or impaired pumping function or the systolic function of the heart. So what was seen in some studies was usually we have 5% of the patients who do not have known heart disease who come to us with impaired LV systolic function, or the pumping function of the heart is impaired there. But in this patient population, we have seen a slight increase, probably 10%, and more so because I think more echoes were done. And another study did 100 patients were followed, and they did an MRI for these patients who showed that the LV function was impaired, as well as there was myocarditis, which was by probably the direct involvement of the heart muscle with the virus. Then patients, because of other factors, because of COVID-19, because they are intubated, or because they have maybe some other infection, and now maybe with the fungal infections which people are having, they can develop sepsis, hypotension, and shock, which can take its toll on the heart as well, and leading to impaired heart function or heart failure. So this I'll be talking about how to monitor that. And then we have microvascular thrombotic injury, once again, with small clots happening either in the heart vessels, in the cerebrovasculature leading to stroke, as well as clot in the veins of the leg, as well in the lungs, leading to PE. So we'll be talking about how to monitor these patients. As well as hypoxemia, I would say that it would be end-stage heart failure patients are developing hypoxemia because of heart disease. And we have seen that the conduction system of the heart, or the electrical supply of the heart, is itself affected, leading to arrhythmias. Patient can have both atrial and ventricular arrhythmias, which some of them can be life-threatening. So this is what happens. You have an asymptomatic phase, then you have a PCR positive phase in which mostly the involvement of the nasopharyngeal tract is there, and then slowly the involvement of other organ systems, which leads to lung predominantly, heart, brain, as well as kidneys has been seen. In the heart, patients can develop chest pain, they can develop palpitations, or they can develop heart failure. So right now it is a running target. There are no clear-cut guidelines how to monitor these patients. Patients with no existing heart failure sent home. People will be fatigued for a long time. We have seen people coming to us 4 or 6 weeks later, they're still tired, they're still fatigued. I recently put a stent in a lady who developed COVID. She was so tired that I was planning to bring her and see her once again in the cath lab to see whether our stents open or not, but she was tested positive for COVID-19, and now she has improved. It takes a long time. It takes several weeks for them to improve. Some people have postulated that if the patients are having just probably repeat a EKG in 4 weeks time and an echo in maybe 12 weeks, but this has not been validated in any study at this point of time. What I would like to say to everybody is, if somebody discharged from the hospital with COVID, if they're having any chest pain, any shortness of breath or palpitations, or they feel that their heart rate is going faster, they should consult their healthcare provider, their physician, so that they can probably do these tests early on. Some of the patients have asked me what kind of exercise should I do when I have been discharged with COVID. So patients with mild symptoms, no existing heart disease, probably they can start doing, probably in terms of, I would say, limited exercise after 2 weeks. Somebody who has moderate to severe COVID, I would say, once again, all these things are nobody has validated anything, but moderate to severe COVID, they can start the exercise probably after 2 weeks, they would be limited. And severe COVID, people have said that probably 4 weeks of rest, and then they can start their activities. But I'm talking about regimented exercise. People should be active even after moderate to severe COVID as well. They should move around. So existing heart disease with COVID, this is the patient population. Unfortunately, many of them succumb to the injuries because of the existing heart problems, because studies have shown that most of the elderly patients who were dying initially were patients who had diabetes, who had high blood pressure, who had high cholesterol levels, and maybe most of them were uncontrolled. So these are the patient populations who unfortunately succumb to the illness in the hospital. And let's say some of those long haulers who survive, and with early initiation of therapy and probably judicious care in the ICU, they do survive. Once again, we are seeing probably Dr. Shamim was also seeing a lot of patients who come with prolonged dyspnea, and maybe we were seeing some amount of pulmonary fibrosis in these patient population as well. In the same manner, we are seeing this patient population with heart failure, with prolonged myocarditis in some anecdotal cases, as well as arrhythmias. So this patient population with existing heart disease who have CAD, they'll be treated in the same manner as we treat if they did not have COVID. Somebody has heart disease, they have to be on aspirin, they have to be on the beta blockers, on the cholesterol lowering medications. Heart failure, once again, the same manner you treat them, you have to treat them. And when you monitor them, I would say probably in this patient population, monitoring them, maybe if the LV function has impaired in the hospital because of all those factors which we have discussed, probably an echo in 12 weeks wouldn't be a bad idea, and an EKG in 4 weeks. And some of these patients, if they continue to have chest pain, may need a stress test as well. So this is a proposed long-term clinical plan for these patients. Patients coming to you, you do a symptom assessment in 4 to 6 weeks and at 12 weeks after discharge. And at that time, if they are having shortness of breath, they're having some chest pain, palpitations, they have to be seen in both the cardiology clinics as well as the pulmonary clinics. Maybe you can do a pulmonary function test for them, maybe do a 6-minute walk test, do an echo, as well as a CT if needed. MRI for myocarditis, some studies have shown, but most of the patients post-viral illness, most of the LV function usually improves. And we don't know what the long-term sequelae from this viral infection is, but most of the viral infections which we see, which affects the heart, LV function improves with the passage of time, and no long-term severe disease is seen in those patients. In the same manner, patients have to be screened for anxiety, depression. I think Dr. Rushi would be touching on this, but I would say that mental health, heart disease is associated with mental health. A lot of patients who do have anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder can develop severe complications of their heart disease as well. And these were some common questions which I thought that people would be asking. What about thromboprophylaxis? Because I've seen this thing happening in the patient population. All the patients admitted to the hospital need prophylaxis for DVT and PE. And in terms of aspirin, studies have been ongoing which say whether aspirin has to be given to this patient population or not. But I think probably medicine is more art than science at this juncture. So I would say probably depending on whether the health provider wants to give aspirin to a patient is not a bad idea. And other novel anticoagulants can be given as well, both in prophylactic dose, but not in mild patients who can move around. But I would say moderate to severe patients can have prophylactic dose of either heparin or novel anticoagulants, or NOACs as we call them. What about vaccination? People have been asking us that should we get vaccines or not? I would say there's no perfect vaccine. Take whichever vaccine you have and take it. Anecdotal reports of vaccine-induced thrombocytopenia or decreased platelets have been reported both with AstraZeneca as well as Johnson & Johnson here, not with Pfizer or Moderna, but this these episodes are few and far between and shouldn't preclude anybody from taking a vaccine. But what you can do is somebody who has existing low platelets or thrombocytopenia from the start, they should consult the healthcare provider for this. Long-term management of myocarditis, I've already talked about. Probably it's a self-limiting disease, and if there's some underlying heart failure, treat the heart failure. Exercise, we've already discussed how to start a regimented exercise. What about regular procedures? Regular procedures in the cardiac cath lab, regular procedures maybe in the pulmonary lab. What about ENT procedures, any other regular procedures? At this point of time, because right now in India, the second wave is probably receding or diminishing or decreasing, I would say probably these procedures can be started, testing COVID for these patients, and take it from there, because our existing patients cannot wait for us, because some of these patients, if they do not seek medical attention, they do die at home. Mental health and heart, I would probably leave this for Dr. Rushi to elaborate more on this topic. And I would be open to any questions. This is my email and my phone number. If anybody has any questions, they can text me as well.
Thank you, Dr. Rahman. You covered most of the topics of heart related to heart in COVID times. Any questions? One question that has been received is that if the CRP is raised 2-3 weeks after discharge, should we give any treatment?
No, I wouldn't say so, because probably you do have a CRP which was done at baseline. So if you look at the picture of the temporal trend of the CRP, it will tell you whether it is decreasing or increasing. If it is increasing, something else is going on, either an infectious process or an inflammatory process, and needs to be seen. If it is decreasing, I wouldn't fret on that CRP level, because you're treating the patient as a whole and not lab values, I would say. People have used D-dimer for prophylaxis. If the D-dimer has been high, there have been some societal guidelines which document that, okay, prophylaxis can be given based on a D-dimer thromboprophylaxis.
How often do you give the anticoagulant after discharge?
There have been different recommendations by different societies. Some societies have said you can give prophylactic or low-dose NOACs for 6 weeks. And some societies have started recommending, there could be some, for very severe patients, there could be an extended duration of 90 days of high risk for these patients to develop a thromboembolic phenomenon.
What about giving
so it will be once again tailored for the patient population?
Oral anticoagulant, that dabigatran and rivaroxaban.
Dabigatran, rivaroxaban, as well as Xarelto, and so edoxaban as well. So all these oral anticoagulants can be given. But I would say probably if somebody is at high risk of bleeding, probably at a lower dose, and very severe disease, who patients are probably not moving around at home as well because it's so severely fatigued, they're dyspneic, they're short of breath. Still, probably extended duration of 90 days is not a bad idea. And some societies have been propagating that.
Regarding vaccination, if a person not having COVID but have some heart problems and angioplasty has been done, so is it,
go ahead, take the vaccine.
Go ahead and go. Okay. What is the modality for post-COVID tachycardia management?
Usually patients will have tachycardia for a lot of different reasons. You and I can get tachycardic when we are in a fight or flight situation. So tachycardia could be because of underlying maybe hypoxemia, decreased oxygen. Tachycardia may be because your heart function is, your heart is not, the systolic function, the pumping function of the heart is not appropriate, and your heart is trying to compensate for it. Maybe you may be having some underlying infection. So what I would do is I would search for the cause and not treat tachycardia as such. Maybe your heart needs that high heart rate at that point of time. So probably would have to consult the healthcare provider and investigate thoroughly what is the reason for tachycardia.
One more question that I received personally is that after vaccination, should we continue anticoagulant or we stop anticoagulant for some time?
No, there's no. The vaccine is just subdermal or inside. No, there's no point of stopping vaccination. You can continue your anticoagulation even before or after vaccination.
Okay. Okay. Thank you, Dr. Rahman. And we hope we will continue in the future also. this
Sure,
webinar.
Shamim bhai, thank you so
Thank
much
you.
for inviting me.
Thank you. I have seen you after 15 years.
you have seen me without hair now.
Yes. Thank you so much. Thank you. Now, our next speaker is Dr. Rushi. She is HOD, Department of Clinical Psychology, RML Hospital, New Delhi. She has done her graduation and post-graduation from AMU Aligarh and PhD from Medical and Clinical Psychology, Ranchi. She received many awards and gold medals for scientific research papers. She also received postgraduate merit scholarship and award during her post-graduation from AMU. She is active in media also, and she is honorary General Secretary of Association of Clinical Psychologists, Delhi NCR region. Now I invite Dr. Rushi to address the gathering.
Yeah. Assalamu alaikum and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's really my pleasure and honor to be a part of this session and discussion. And my sincere regards and gratitude to Professor Tariq Mansoor, Vice Chancellor, Aligarh Muslim University, and Dr. A.K. Singh Rana, Medical Superintendent and Director, RML Hospital, for their presence for this session. And especially Dr. Rakesh Bhargava, Dean, Faculty of Medicine, Chairperson, Department of TB and Chest, Jain Medical College, AMU, and Dr. Shamim sir, and the other respected dignitaries for taking a visionary initiative and part of the AMU to bring about a better transformation in the life of people for maintaining good physical and mental health. I'm also thankful to all the esteemed panelists who have reflected and will be reflecting just after my lecture better on the topic today in this session. So it's a time when we all need each other. We should connect with each other for sharing and caring. I'm sure that this kind of initiative will bring millions of hearts and minds together to create better climate for better physical, mental health and well-being. The corona pandemic has already taken up and it has shaken us basically. The entire humanity has been shaken up, the roots have been shaken up. And there is a great amount of gloom, the uncertainty and anxiety like you all talking about in the beginning. So this coronavirus pandemic has a global threat on this 21st century. Over the last 1 year, there has been significant rise in the number of deaths. The mortality is so high due to this infection, and it is perhaps more than 1.5 lakhs people who are dying, who have died in the last 1 year. Our Vice Chancellor, AMU Vice Chancellor were also highlighting this thing, that there were a lot of, the mortality was so high in the university also, like probably more than 40 people we have lost in the last month. So it has posed an unprecedented challenge to our health system, economy, and the infrastructure of most of the world. The pandemic has affected our physical health as well as mental health to a very greater extent. This pandemic has undoubtedly affected us. It has increased our worries and concern about physical health. So people, because of this pandemic, now the people are exposed to unpredictability. We are exposed to uncertainty, the associated lockdowns, the physical distancing, the economic breakdown, and the most recently, the breakdown of the healthcare system when there is a huge scarcity or huge difference between the supply and demand. In India, we have increased the risk of like mental health issues. So there are, in our helpline numbers, in our OPDs, there are a lot of people who are emerging, who are coming with a lot of mental health issues nowadays. It has seen over the past 1 year that routine health services, including mental health care, are adversely affected in many countries, including India. Research and several lay media reports are also suggesting an increase in mental health issues such as anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, and insomnia, anger in general population, health workers, as well as people who are in isolation, who are maintaining the quarantine. So the rapidly emerging mental health issues may destabilize the individual's general well-being and have immense potential to influence the health system. Hence, they need urgent and immediate attention and action. There are several risk factors that attribute to the development of psychological symptoms during this COVID-19 pandemic. So these may be the biological risk factors like the female, children, elderly, and especially the people who are having other comorbidities. There may be other social risk factors like living alone or low socioeconomic strata. The risk factors may be psychological, the people who have lost someone very near and dear, so bereavement of the loved one or the grief or the poor coping skills. And definitely economic risk factors are there because people are losing job day by day. There are significant emotional crises are being faced by many of the people in our country. That is also very important reason for emerging there heightened mental health issues among people. So prevalence of psychological morbidities among the general population, healthcare workers, and COVID-19 patients, it has seen that about half of the patients, half of the population is facing these psychological impact of COVID-19 pandemic. So, more than half of the people are facing these problems. So in research, in the past 1 year in India also, in research, it has been pointed out that there are, about 40% of people who are reporting sleep issues. There are about 35% of people who are facing stress and who are reporting psychological distress and stress. And there was recently online survey was done where it was found that about 3/4 of the participants, they reported moderate level of stress. 3/4 mean about there were 75% of the people who reported stress and significant poor well-being. So stress has been invariably associated because the level of inflammatory cytokines is elevated. And it is hypothesized that because of this infection and the stressors arising out of this illness, this is related, and it's related, especially its related outcomes that may lead to increase in the risk of developing psychiatric illnesses. So like Dr. Rana was also pointing out that there is post-COVID, especially there is increase in the steroid-induced psychosis. What happens, it is subsequently result in immune dysfunction, which increase in the cytokine level. So both the things are interrelated. The infection bhi logon ka badh raha hai dheere dheere, aur saath mein mental health issues hone ki wajah se, lot of people, they are reporting to OPDs who are coming with psychosis nowadays. Psychosis, it's a severe mental psychiatric illness. So generally, when stressful events occur, it has been found that certain section of the population, such as females, children, and elderly, they are at higher risk of experiencing difficulties. And like RML is having, our department is running a helpline free of cost for all the people all over India, where, in that helpline, and I am the member of many other helpline also, like CBSC and some other organizations. So what I have noticed that lot of people are reporting these kind of problem. Lot of people, the most of the calls, they are coming from the elderly people, especially for the children and adolescents. So adults are calling for their children. So hypochondriac concerns are there. They are very common, like worrying about being infected. So it can be established as a cause for developing anxiety and depression. So, if you will be more worried about that, something may happen to you, unnecessary worry, because there is uncertainty. So people are worried for no reason. So this constant fear that the epidemic could be hard to control, and the unknown, and the causes are unknown, which impacts actually our personal and social lives. So these hypochondriacal issues are very common. And definitely in the last year, also, few years back, when there was another pandemic, it was seen that, after the pandemic, the post-traumatic stress disorder emerged. So maybe we can just hope that after 1 year or 1.5 years, we can have more cases of post-traumatic stress disorders. So the specific mental health issues during this COVID pandemic, what have been seen in the OPD level, what we have heard in the helpline, and what we have gone through different researches, it is found that the emotional problems like fear, anger, mood swings, criticism, and sometimes people are reporting emotional numbness, poor coping. It has been reported by most of the people. People are also reporting changes in their biological functioning because their sleep is impaired, their sexual functioning is impaired. There may be reduction and loss of appetite. And it may increase to, sometimes the appetite is, people are reporting increase in the appetite also. as a coping mechanism. So, the various cognitive issues in the elderly, especially the children and adolescents, have been reported, like poor attention concentration, poor memory, inability to make decision, heightened alertness, perceptual and cognitive distortions, intrusive and unwelcome memories. So people are also reporting low self-esteem, confidence, and denial, of course. So psychological and personality issues, like I was talking about, the emotional outburst and anger outburst, or withdrawal, or lack of ability to interact with other people, or inability to regulate the substance, because there is increase in the alcohol use or in the tobacco use nowadays. People are reporting there is increase in the risk-taking behavior, so self-harm and suicide has increased. Somatization issues has been increased. People are unable to handle their stress, so they are reporting those somatization issues. So they will have pain they will have muscle pain, they will have headache. So the manifestation or the underlying factors is stress, basically, for these things. So, and at the OPD level also, we have noticed that there is some common phenomena, that is a paranoia. So people have become very suspicious also, and this suspiciousness and psychosis, and anger outburst, irritability, this is very common in the post-COVID time. So post-COVID, people are reporting these kind of symptoms. So spending most of the time at home due to lockdown increases the risk of excessive use of internet and binge watching of television, which may later lead to technological addiction. So nowadays, lot of calls and lot of people in the OPDs also, they have reporting these problems of internet addiction or technology addiction, especially for their kids who are adolescents. And of course, adults are also reporting these kind of problems. Even the elders, they all are reporting. So mental health of the elderly is also especially at risk regarding because of their pre-existing health problems, basically, like cardiovascular, neuromuscular, neurocognitive disorders, by autoimmune disorders, compromise. And especially what happens there, that their immunity is compromised at this age. So they are more vulnerable in developing dementia and depression. So, so this is for all the audience, for the lay person, basically, that you have to be very alert. So if the symptoms are to that extent, that if you are thinking that it is at the syndromal level, the elder people in your family are having dementia or depression, so you should consult to the professionals. Am I audible?
Yes, yes.
Okay. So another sort of people, like I was talking about, children and adolescents. So they have also affected by this pandemic in a variety of, or in a very different way, which is very different from us, basically. Why? Because the schools and the playgrounds, they have been closed. So they are having feelings of sadness and feelings of isolation. They don't have any other platform, because their social needs are much more high as compared to us, because these are their basic developmental milestones. So their socio-emotional milestones have been they have been stuck at this age, at this time, this pandemic time. Children of healthcare workers and emergency services, they are also suffering, because they are kept at home. When both the parents are working, they are going outside. Social distancing protocols and lockdowns not only affect their perception of the pandemic, but it also may increase their fear, anxiety, and behavioral and emotional issues, what people are reporting in the CGC clinics also. So the parents have also reported that these kind of, the children and adolescents, they show very temper tantrums also. There is regression in their behavior. Adolescents are trying out substance to use coping. So just to working for their coping, so what is happening, that they are taking the help of some substances. So they are going towards the maladaptive coping strategies. So, and this unhealthy coping mechanism can lead to development of short-term and long-term mental health issues, not only in children and adolescents, but also among the adults. So stigma is something that creates certain challenges to a person in the family during post-COVID also. So I just wanted to just highlight a few of the factors that attribute to this higher stigma, like because it's a highly contagious nature of illness. And there are tedious prevention measures, there is social distancing, non-availability of drugs or beds. So people are having terror and this what happen if we will have this thing. Make it scary to be perceived by the general population. So atmosphere of fear or a sense of the sense of apprehension or impending doom is perceived among the healthcare providers also, and especially of course by the general public also. So I'll just give you one example that our director sir was highlighting this point, that the department is working, our residents especially, it's really appreciable that they're working from morning till evening in the ICU duties. So initially what happened, that there was very apprehension or fear in their mind. So they had rejection for the COVID duties in ICU by saying that, they are, so we literally had to conduct CBT sessions with them just to enhance their motivation to doing those duties. So that terror and fear is not only among the general population, it is also among the healthcare professionals. So so I think so just short, I will say that apart from causing physical sickness, this COVID-19 is causing many psychiatric or mental health issues or problems also. It's not necessary that the person is having mental health issues at syndromal level. So sometimes the issues are at subsyndromal level, but definitely the stress, anxiety, and depression, it's very common. Trauma is there, grief and loss people are reporting. So there are disturbance in the daily routine because the routine is altered. The business are closed, education is impacted, healthcare, health system is impacted, mental health is impacted. And of course, because of the social isolation, people are, because of the physical distancing and all, people are having so much of anxiety and stress. So the Times has already predicted and proved that the second wave of this pandemic has been accompanied by large spikes in mental health issues during and post-COVID pandemic. So on the top of all, the reality is that nearly, like I have said, that nearly about 154,000 deaths in the country recently reported, and there is increase, like many of us are forced to, lose our loved ones during this time. So a lot of grief is there. So because without the regular rituals, often we get very uncomfortable because we see that that how we will be able to come out of this grief period. So this solidarity aspect of Greece has been magnified by this pandemic, because the social ties that bind us and enable us to survive in this difficult time in our lives, it has been severely tested right now. The rituals of grieving that have a social element, such as friends or the family gathering or sharing meals together, it is having an impact on that. So people have lot of fear कि अगर मेरे फैमिली में एक तो anticipated grief is too much, so the people are reporting कि मेरे क्या अगर मुझे कुछ हो गया या मेरी फैमिली को कुछ हो गया, तो because there is problems in the there are challenges in the healthcare system, तो मुझे बेड नहीं मिलेगा, मुझे ऑक्सीजन नहीं मिलेगी, अगर कोई डेथ हो जाती है तो I will not be able to meet people, I will not be able to meet my family will not be able to see me. So when the person is going to ICU na, so it has been reported in the it has been very closely observed in the ICU also, that the people who are in a better position also, they are having so much significant fear and apprehension and anxiety that they are not sure, there is uncertainty that whether they'll be going back to their home or not. So and lot of phone calls, people are reporting these problems of grief because there were deaths in their family. So what can we so basically now the point is that how can we cope up with this new reality, because this is the reality, we have to accept it. What can we offer in the way of comfort to loved ones? So basically, the people who have lost someone because of this virus, or people who are experiencing grief because of another cause of death of a loved one, but still remain bound by these new restrictions due to this pandemic. So we have to be creative in the ways we seek social support by using whatever pathways we have, including technology or by connecting with others. And we are observing also that a lot of people now in their family, they are pursuing those rituals online. So what is important here is that we have to recognize and we have to understand that grieving is a process. While the regular rituals or activities that we associate with grieving have not been fulfilled or that had been appended, we can hope temporarily at least that this doesn't mean that we cannot develop new rituals or new ways of praying to homage our loved ones and derive meaning from the loss. So these are the few things we have to keep in our mind just to relieve ourselves from this process of grief. We can never underestimate the power of a telephone call or a letter or a card by sending somebody who is in grief. You just have to make another person realize that you are thinking about them. Just as grieving is a process, so is the living. And we could all benefit from digging deeper and deriving meaning and direction to ourselves during this challenging time. So I was talking about that, a lot of people were reporting stress and uncertainty and anxiety during COVID, post-COVID, because they're very anxious about that what is going to happen in their future, what they can do to protect themselves, just to save themselves. So we have to just realize that we just need to understand that stress is a normal experience and it becomes pathological only when it overpowers us. So it blocks our ability to make better decisions for ourselves. It makes you feel stuck. It can cause emotional outbursts. It may cause mental health issues, physical issues, and it can invite many situations that can create harm. So you may convert this energy to something that is powerful, something that is productive, something that can help you to create better future. So basically you have to understand that stress is an energy which is coming from our thoughts and emotions, and we can control our thoughts and emotions. We have a control over that. And most of these thoughts and emotions, you may turn this energy you can turn these thoughts and emotions to something, you may turn this energy basically to something which is passionate, something which is purposeful, and something which is powerful. So you may create a life that you truly deserve and you simply you're expecting from you by understanding and working on the adaptive coping and enhancing resilience. So resilience, developing or enhancing resilience is very important nowadays. Psychological resilience is the ability to mentally or emotionally cope up with the crisis or to return to pre-crisis status quickly. The more resilient you are, the better you are able to tolerate your feelings of sadness and anxiety. So see, we all go through the bad times in our life. We all have experiences of disappointments, loss, or change. We all feel sad at some point of time in our life. We all feel anxious or, depressed. But building resilience can help you to maintain a positive outlook, facing an uncertain future with less fear and get through even the darkest days. So resilience can function as a protective factors under these stressful conditions. What you need to do, you have to focus on what is in your control. You cannot stop hypothetical worries about, worries from occurring. What you can do, you can control your response to them, right? So what is there in our control? We can build the resilience, we can care and love people.
Am I audible? Just a minute.
Ji. Should I continue?
Yes.
Actually, the meeting scheduled time is up to 10 p.m. And so I think one speaker is left still.
Yeah. So I'll just finish in 5 minutes. I'll just finish in just few tips I just want to give to the people who are, to our viewers who are connected at this time. So you just need to enhance your resilience. You can, I'm just talking about that what is there in your control. So you can control your thoughts and their interpretation. You can control your routine. You can inculcate some relaxation exercise, breathing exercise. You can have a control over your eating pattern, your diet. You can exercise. You can seek and offer support to other people, but you don't have control over other people's health. We don't have control over the death of the loved ones. We don't have control on the government actions or about the school opening and closing or the state of healthcare system. We cannot stop others to get infected. So basically you have to power your mind, not the outside events. And you, once you have realized this, you can find out the strength within yourself. And of course, time is running short, so I will not go into the detail. I can just prescribe you that you can practice mindfulness on daily basis. It is free of cost. There are many apps also. It is available on the Google. So you can download the app and you can practice. You can learn from there that how to, you can start from the breathing mindfulness. You can practice gratitude, because you can write a journal. You can just going for a gratitude walk. You can appreciate the environment. You can acknowledge or appreciate the small things, that the sight, hearing, taste and smell or touch in your life. You can maintain a diary daily. You can write down the small things what are happening positive, what is happening positive to your life, because it will increase this practice of gratitude. There are and you can find out these gratitude, several gratitude exercises on the net also. So you can adopt any one of that, and it is certainly will increase your mood. It will strengthen your immune system. Research shows that it helps you out in improving your sleep pattern. It reduces aggression, enhances your self-esteem, and more importantly, it increases your empathy. And definitely other doctor was also talking about this, about the regular exercise. This is also very important, because exercises releases endorphins, which releases basically the hormones or the chemicals which are important in the for our maintaining good mood. It enhances your energy level or concentration. You can have a feeling of euphoria, and it's something most of us can fit into our lives when it becomes our priority. So any one of us, we can practice. Even if you are doing your regular exercise or simply walk thrice or 4 times in a week, that is more than enough. And in the long term also, it will enhance your memory. It can enhance your cognitive functioning, your mood and self-esteem. So these were the, small things like maintaining good sleep hygiene also. Sleeping for 6 to 8 hours is also very important. Indulging in some family rituals or family time, family fun activities, deep breathing, all these things are important. And you shouldn't forget that whenever you are having crisis, whenever you are feeling there is a need, consult a health professional, whether a psychiatrist or a clinical psychologist. You should consult them. And nowadays there is a provision of telepsychiatry and telepsychotherapy, telecounseling also. Even our department, and there are so many departments who are offering services online. I will be sharing my helpline number in the chat box. You can have that number. You can call to that helpline number anytime from 9 to 4 on the working days. So this is what I just wanted to highlight, that mental health has to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic by making it more acceptable, making it more affordable and accessible to everyone in the country. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Roshi, for putting light on the psychiatric problems related to COVID-19. Any questions? Please drop in the chat box. Now our last speaker is Dr. Ari Mustaqim sir. He's a well-known figure in medical college and in Delhi also. Whenever we have some problem, we contact Dr. Ari Mustaqim sir. So please wrap up everything. Thank you.
Ari bhai has to wait for long today.
Please unmute, Ari sir. Please unmute yourself.
I'm very happy to be the last speaker today, because I think majority of topics are very well covered by Abdur Rahman and Dr. Roshi. And so I'll just come straight away to my topic, which was cardiac complications in the post-COVID state. So, and what we are actually experiencing these days. We are seeing that a lot of time patients who have been discharged from the hospital or who have been shifted from COVID ward to the normal areas in the hospital who are still sick. So these patients who get shifted to other normal areas in the hospital, they are the ones who had bad pneumonia. And so they are still on the either on the oxygen or some for some other reason they are still in the hospital. So in such situation, when we call these patients and get their echo done, a lot of time what we are finding, their heart function has deteriorated significantly. And so we must keep in mind that these patients who are having shortness of breath, requiring high oxygen level, they may be suffering from the cardiomyopathy. The heart has deteriorated in its functioning. And a lot of time this is happening, and we must keep in mind that thing. As a doctor, we are keeping in mind, as a common person also, the people should also know that the heart can get also affected. So some patients who have been managed at home with oxygen, because there were beds not available during these times. So in such a scenario, what we have to understand that if this breathlessness is persisting following the complete treatment, then we must get their heart evaluated. The possible diseases which have come up in this time is the heart attack, the cardiomyopathy, where the heart muscle becomes weak. And another thing that is quite, I've seen a number of patients, I don't know from where this misconception comes, that they say that oxygen saturation 85 is okay. So they should try to keep their oxygen concentrator or the oxygen level to the minimum, whatever extra they are using. So they say we just keep the oxygen at 2 level, and with 2 level we are maintaining 85% of saturation. And as a result, what is happening? They are hypoxic, their sympathetic drive is very high, they are having high heart rate, constantly the pulse is going to 110, 20, 130, the blood pressure is shooting up, they are becoming irritable. And a lot of time these patients, when they have to go to loo, that time they are even removing their oxygen. And when they go to the loo, the oxygen saturation is dropping down further. So a lot of time they are either collapsing in the bathrooms, or while coming back from the bathroom, they are becoming very breathless. So people have to understand that even those who have recovered and whose oxygen level at room air has come to 95, 96 level, on resting condition, when they are starting exerting, going to the loo and doing all the activities there, which is quite an exertion for them, they invariably decompensate and deteriorate out there. So you and everybody must remember that particular thing. And please try to keep the oxygen level above 94, no matter how much oxygen you have to give. So for that, we have to treat your lungs in a better way, so that slowly and slowly your oxygen requirement will come down. But do whatever you have to do to keep the oxygen level at 94 and above levels. If there is a COPD, then obviously we maintain slightly on the lower side, but normal people, we want to maintain slight higher level. And I think Dr. Shamim will be a right person to answer this. But this is one of the things that we are observing patients who are coming to us. Another thing that we are seeing quite frequently is the anxiety in these patients. People are coming, telling us that they are having palpitation. And a lot of time it is the low level of oxygen saturation. But at other times, what my previous speaker has spoken in detail about the reasons for the anxiety. So all those reasons without any heart disease are also there. But there are heart diseases which can result in the palpitation to the patient. Sometimes these patients are developing low pulse rate. Sometimes they are developing very high pulse rate. And sometimes there are extra beats coming in. And I think there is hardly any disease of the pulse rate, low, high, or in between, and normal pulse rate going to very high level, or abnormal patterns coming in. Some of them can be life-threatening also. So all of them are possible in post-COVID patients. And so whenever something like that is happening, please consult one of the cardiologists and get yourself evaluated properly. Don't ignore this thing. So in medicine, we always use the word cardiopulmonary. So whenever in the follow-up you are coming to the hospital, invariably what you require is a consultation with a cardiologist and the pulmonologist both. So these are the few important things that I want to highlight. Another thing that we have seen that the patients in the post-COVID time, some of them are having sudden death. And for them, whatever Dr. Rahman also described, that the prophylactically, you have to give certain drugs to prevent the clot formation, because clot, if it forms in the heart, it results in a major heart attack also. If it forms in the brain, people get paralysis attacks, acute coronary, this CVA. So these things are happening. The clot forms in the lungs, results in pulmonary embolism. And that also is very dangerous, and people have died because of that. So all these things are quite possible. We are seeing every day. So it is very, very important that you please come to the hospital or do a teleconsult and then come to the hospital. Please don't have the belief in the mind that the hospitals are treating only COVID patients and all other patients are not taken care of. Your delay to coming to the hospital will actually harm you and will result in difficulty in treating you subsequently. So please come whenever you feel there is any issue. And a lot of time, even when the acute COVID stage is there, when the fever is just started, some of the patients are coming with acute heart attack, and those patients have undergone angioplasty. They have successfully survived those acute attack. Otherwise, they would have died if the angioplasty was not done. So, and heart failure patients are also coming in. Plus the patients who already have a baseline heart disease, because any febrile illness can decompensate them. उनका जो वो दवाई चल रहा था अब तक जिससे वो स्टेबल थे, वो ट्रीटमेंट के बाद ठीक चल रहे थे, वो एक एपिसोड ऑफ कोई भी फीवर की तबीयत खराब जो होती है, चाहे कोई और वायरल हो या निमोनिया हो, जो कि कोविड भी हो सकता है, वो उनको पुश कर देता है बहुत नीचे की तरफ, और वो हो सकता है कि फिर से हार्ट फेलियर में चले जाएं या उनको एंजाइना के अटैक्स आने लग जाए या उनको हार्ट अटैक आ जाए. तो अगर कोई भी हार्ट का पेशेंट है, उसको अगर कोविड हो गया है, तो उसके लिए ये बहुत ज़रूरी है कि अपने कार्डियोलॉजिस्ट को ज़रूर कंसल्ट करें और उनको लूप पे रखें कि मेरी ये दवाइयाँ चल रही हैं. एंड स्पेशली जैसे एजिथ्रोमाइसिन है, बहुत कॉमनली यूज दवाई है, लेकिन वो हम हर पेशेंट को नहीं दे सकते, बिकॉज हार्ट ईसीजी के अंदर कुछ चीज़ें होती हैं जिनको हमको देखकर आगे बढ़ना होता है. तो बेसलाइन ईसीजी करा लेना ज़रूरी होता है. इनफैक्ट बहुत सारे पेशेंट्स हैं जो इस तरह की चीज़ों के कॉम्प्लिकेशन से सफ़र किया है. आई थिंक मैं अब यहीं पर रुकूंगा और शमीम साहब को आई थिंक अनदर 5-6 मिनट्स का टाइम रहेगा कि कुछ वो अपनी बात कह सके, और अगर कुछ सवालात हैं तो उनके जवाब दे सके.
आरिफ भाई कुछ क्वेश्चंस शमीम भाई. आरिफ भाई.
Thank you, Arif bhai, for your nice presentation. One question that we are facing, that after COVID, the patient who are on antihypertensive, the dose is decreasing. I mean, they land up in hypertension. So is there any effect of COVID?
This is a very common observation that the antihypertensive dose requirement is going very low.
Yes.
But at the same time, there are some patients where this requirement is going up also. Especially the patients who are hypoxic, who are not maintaining good amount of oxygenation, and who are having psychological issues. There, the anxiety, tachycardia, hypertension, it is coming in combination. And on the other hand, there are patients. One of the reason what we are finding that the water intake of these patients is quite low. And plus the hot weather is coming. This was actually the time when we always used to decrease the antihypertensive dosing of the patients also. So every year when the winter is start, we have to increase their antihypertensives. And when this summer starts, we have to decrease their antihypertensives. So this is coincidence that this thing is happening at this time that majority of patients are recovering from COVID and this hot weather has come. And a lot of patients, you will be knowing as a COVID in charge there, that people are not using AC these days who have recovered from COVID, and they want to keep everything which is cold away from them. So there is a lot of sweating, and probably that is one of the key reason. So I'm telling people that please hydrate yourself adequately. Don't get dehydrated. And obviously the medicines will require to be adjusted. Shamim साहब की आवाज नहीं आ रही है.
For this is for Dr. Abdur Rahman. One question for both COVID and post-COVID patient in New York has some allergic problem with flowers growing in the season all over city there in USA. So in such case, what precautionary measures should be followed in this case? As for emergency case, should we keep nasal spray too?
Honestly, I wasn't aware of any such thing, but if there has been any hypersensitivity or allergic reaction to stuff, I think taking an anti-allergic for a few days if somebody develops symptoms is not a bad idea, but I wouldn't take it on a regular or a routine basis. And I wasn't aware of any hypersensitivity reaction to any pollens or allergens, especially after COVID, but they may have been some.
And one more question, that after 14 days of discharge from the hospital, SpO2 is decreasing to 87 to 88 during sleep. So what should be the reason? One reason I think is OSA. One reason I think is that OSA.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. You would be the best person to answer this, but probably both the pulmonary system as well as the cardiac system will be responsible. Unlikely the heart, most likely the OSA, or maybe some underlying, maybe pulmonary fibrosis, or some still maybe remnants of some, I would say, congestion or pathology of the lungs. Maybe still there is some amount of remnant or residual pneumonia there, which is causing inadequate oxygenation there. What do you think, Shamim Bhai? Any other thoughts on this?
I should ask question from the whether he or she is obese or not, so that we can have a sleep study. Then we can say what is the problem. Ideally, she should go for a sleep study.
Absolutely.
One question for Arif Bhai.
Yes, please go ahead.
Arif Bhai, in hypertensive cases, what we have seen that in COVID and post-COVID, the blood pressure has shot in many patients and who are not even hypertensive also. So medicine, what's going to be the course of medicine for those patients? There is so many questions, I'm telling you, so many problems that, you know, people who are hypertensive, they just start walking, you know, there's so much panic among the, even in non-COVID patients. So doses and all.
Yes. See, one of the things that we have to make sure during these talks on the webinars, that we cannot make this as a platform to guide the therapy. We can just give you a gross guideline, what you should be doing. But for a specific therapy, we will always ask you to please contact us. And through different, I think Asif has made a couple of WhatsApp groups where I'm part of them also. And if anybody needs any consult, then one-to-one we are doing that thing also and advising. Because everybody requires a specific, and we have to look into a couple of things before we prescribe that you have to go for a calcium channel or an ARB or an ACE inhibitor or a beta blocker. And so many patients, especially I would like to highlight it to Dr. Shamim, that so many patients who were on beta blockers earlier, cardiac patients, we have been switching them over to ivabradine because of the pulmonary hyperactive situation following COVID pneumonia. And so it's not that as a blanket statement, we can say that if the hypertension is there, then you just start these medicines. Obviously, there are certain medicines which are relatively safer. So those are the first ones which we prescribe before we get the investigations done or we see you in detail. Because a lot of time we are getting telephone calls also. So there are some ones which are very neutral, which will not have much impact. Like somebody may be having a kidney dysfunction also. Somebody may be having like pneumonia, COVID pneumonia, and breathlessness because of the COVID itself. So there are certain antihypertensive drugs which cannot be used in those patients. So each patient will be unique and each patient will be requiring certain medicines. And this has to be understood by every one of us that we have to consult the doctor and then start the medication. Please don't start it on your own. My number is there in majority of places, and you are most welcome to contact me on my WhatsApp number, and I'll be happy to reply to you in whatever time it may be. Shamim sir.
Thank you, Dr. Arif sir. Any questions from the audience? Yes, Dr. Mr. Sahu.
Sir, my question is, if we take the vaccine, so how much time it take to complete develop antibody in the body?
See, it take around 2 weeks after the second dose.
After second dose.
After
Suppose
second dose.
I have taken one first dose, so it is not affected 50%, or after second dose it work on body.
Ideally, we should check antibodies after second dose, 2 weeks after the second dose.
Okay.
So full protection is after the second dose.
Okay. And so there are many myths about the means in the vaccination. Some people say it's very allergic. Some problem may be created. Rashes. So in such cases, is I have seen the study 0.6 pupil among the 20 lakhs have some very difficult problems. So it is how we can check it's correct information or not.
See, in Aligarh GNMC, we have a clinical trial on 1,000 subjects, and none of the volunteer subjects complained any type of allergic reaction. Some type of reaction is suppose you are giving the vaccine, local pain, swelling. This is obvious, but any serious reaction we don't find in any of the volunteers.
शमीम साहब, मैं यहाँ थोड़ी सी बात कहना चाहूँगा, बिकॉज हम लोग के सेंटर में वैक्सीनेशन भी काफी हुआ था, सारे स्टाफ को वैक्सीनेशन किया गया था, एंड लकीली नन ऑफ अस डेवलप एनी एलर्जिक और दोज कॉम्प्लिकेशंस. आई थिंक 0.1% लोग ऐसे रहे होंगे जिनको के कुछ एलर्जिक रिएक्शन, थोड़ा बहुत रैश कुछ हुआ या उन लोगों ने कुछ दवाई लिया. फीवर माइल्ड हुआ था बहुत सारे लोगों को. बट जो एक चीज हम लोग देख रहे हैं, बिकॉज पेशेंट्स आ रहे हैं कहीं और से वैक्सीनेट होकर और एडमिट हुए हैं हमारे यहाँ, जिसमें पेशेंट को पोस्ट वैक्सीनेशन हार्ट अटैक भी हुआ है और पोस्ट वैक्सीनेशन हाई ग्रेड फीवर लाइक 103 परसिस्टिंग फॉर 9-10 days, और उसके बाद जब उनको एंटीबायोटिक्स वगैरह दिया गया है तब जाकर वो सेटल हुआ है. एंड देयर वाज वन पेशेंट हु हैड पिक्चर क्वाइट सिमिलर टू कोविड, but he had no this RT-PCR was negative, and antigen test was also negative in that patient. So it was a difficult situation to decide what is happening to him, but obviously anti-inflammatory drugs were being given to him and he improved. So we have not lost any patient. And a stroke patient also, 2 of them we have seen with the stroke also post vaccination. So rarely, it's very, very rare, because crores of patients are getting vaccination now. And like with any other drug or with any other vaccine, a minuscule number rahega who will develop complications. Majority will not have any complications. And so the best way forward today is to go and get vaccinated. इसके बारे में कोई second thought नहीं है.
Maybe the vaccination coincide with the COVID infection. In such cases, I think there is a surge of cytokine and patient land up in the hospital. So ideally, those who are having fever for the last 1 week, they should not go for vaccination.
The other question, what's the duration then?
That once a person who is going for vaccination, he should not have fever for last 1 week.
Shamim bhai, conclude, I think.
One question is that should we go for antibody test before vaccination?
No, unless and until you have been known to be infected, there's no point on going for an antibody test before infection, because post-COVID, there have been guidelines when to get vaccinated. And if somebody does not have COVID, probably there's no need for any antibody titer. And just for the previous point, I would say that probably some patients, when they get the first dose of vaccine, some people, they think, ab to Ganga naha liya, kuch nahi karna hai, you're done. So probably they get exposed to COVID after that as well, and they get COVID infections.
One question, do the people without pneumonia, that is severe COVID, like only severe fatigue, body ache and malaise, also reported to have cardiac complaints?
Haribhai, do you want to take this?
I didn't get the question. Let me just...
Do the people without pneumonia, like only with severe fatigue, body ache and malaise, also reported to have cardiac complaints?
Yes. We have seen at least 2 of them came as an acute heart attack to us. And both of them, we have to take them to the cath lab. The protocol is that we assume that they are all COVID positive, such patients. So all the protocols were maintained. They were taken to the cath lab, angioplasty was done. And subsequently, their RT-PCR came out to be positive. And so it was assumed that it was the COVID that has resulted in acute heart attack in these patients. And there was one patient where we have taken this patient for an angio, and the angio turned out to be normal one. But the presentation was, this is what Dr. Abdur Rahman was mentioning about the stress cardiomyopathy. So this was a case of stress cardiomyopathy. So these 3 patients I remember, which we have seen recently. And so without pneumonia also, we are having cardiac complications in patients.
And just to add, there have been a couple of studies. In fact, there has been a study in which says that mild COVID and asymptomatic COVID, 30% of the patients may have some mild cardiac involvement, but nothing has to be done for that. And even autopsy studies have shown that. But as I said previously, that probably long-term, there wouldn't be any long-term sequelae of anything. It is just because you're testing it, you find it. So people with mild COVID, with just fatigue, nothing, just keep an eye on them, and no preemptive measures have to be taken.
The one question is, what should be the duration of anticoagulant post-COVID? Should it be directed by D-dimer, or should we stop?
People have directed it as per the D-dimer, some societies. And as I had alluded to in my talk, that there have been differing opinions from society. Some people say 6 weeks, and some people have said that severe patients extended duration of 90 days. But I would leave it to the discretion of the treating provider. Because some patients may have some comorbidities, they may not be moving around, so probably keeping them on an extended duration of prophylaxis or anticoagulation would be helpful.
Okay, last question. After having treatment for COVID and recovery, after what time the second dose of vaccination should be taken? The first dose was taken just 15 days before developing viral fever.
So this is for you.
See, when we started with the trial, the protocol says 15 days after you are RT-PCR negative. But now the guidelines says that 3 months after you are asymptomatic. So it's up to you. You can take the antibody test also. If you have very high antibody, it is going to protect you for the next 6 months. So you can take after 3 months the second dose.
Thank you, Dr. Shamim, for coordinating it so well.
Thank you.
And again, I must thank Asif also for coming up with these ideas. And I think they are going to go a long way. I think one thing that is still will be complained sooner or later, that the non-medical people, they were not able to ask questions. And because I think a couple of them have a lot of questions. And we must devise some way where we can let them ask more questions in subsequent seminars.
Today, more doctors have participated. That's the reason.
Okay.
It's a webinar, so most of the people, I think, from RML, JNMC, and other institutes also have participated.
Okay.
So
anyway,
I thank Dr. Rushi, Dr. Ari Mustaqim, Dr. Abdur Rahman, Professor Aftab, and all the attendees. Thank you very much, and we will meet soon again. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this excellent webinar.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much.